people, there's a couple of things. There's actually a number of thoughts here. Financially sound is one of the slivers of a much broader aspect of being safe. When I talked about risk and risk aversion, the kind of risk that you avoid is not just financially unsound companies. That's one of a number of things. I mean, for example, you worry about the governance aspects, you worry about things like not just bad balance sheet, bad business models, bad industries. Sometimes you avoid bad industries. For example, a typical industry to avoid, for my purpose, is an industry with limited barriers to entry. Limited barriers to entry. So we buy companies which are depressed, where industries are depressed, companies are having difficulties. And we're very patient investors. We're happy owning these things for a long period of time, such that when times turn around, these companies do really well. Now, when I say really well, is they have a period where they earn, I'd say, supernormal profits. The problem with having a company which is depressed, but in an industry where entry is easy, you will have very, very short periods with supernormal profits. Which is one of the reasons that you will see our sort of bias. Yes, while we're value investors. Yes, while we don't buy franchises. Yes, while we don't buy the sort of obvious brands and moats. Our companies do have some barriers to entry. So, that's an element of my safety, sort of the safety I seek. So financial soundness is one of those characteristics. So how do financially sound companies become cheap? Well, here's the thing. We are long-term investors. We're shamelessly long-term. And I have no qualms about dropping anchor with the view that I'm going to own this thing for 3 to 5 years. And my sort of approach to this and to my younger colleagues is that if this is not something I'm going to go to bed with every night for the next 5 years, I don't want to own it. It's just not worth it. So what that does, it raises the bar in terms of soundness across all these different parameters. Why do these things become cheaper? Well, sometimes people are very fixated on earnings. Earnings disappointed, ROEs drop, sometimes adverse things happen. This presents an opportunity to us. For example, just to give an example of a company that we used to own, we were a large shareholder, an Australian agricultural company, which Viterra actually wound up buying. The stupidest thing made it cheap. This company was a monopoly, kind of like Viterra, same business, in Southern Australia. It was a monopoly. And it was, as a monopoly, it was not a very clever monopoly. It was sort of a half-hearted monopoly. What's a half-hearted monopoly? It's a monopoly where you're the only supplier, and all you have to show for being a monopoly is only 3% of your assets. Now that's not a very clever monopoly, right? So you could, presumably you could start slowly, gradually tweaking it higher and higher, but they were very slow about that. So it was a very imperceptible improvement in the rate of return on capital. And so we reasoned, look, this is so cheap. This is so cheap as a monopoly. And what made it cheap as a monopoly, it was a very financially sound company, was that they had a bad year weather-wise. There was a drought in Australia. This, I think, probably goes back to the 2005-06 period, December 2005. And we got very busy December 2005, early 2006. That was the Australian summer, bad harvests. The thing about this company is earnings were very linked to the amount of grain grown in southern Australia. Because of the bad harvest, because of the drought, there was a lower harvest. There were less grain was handled. Less grain was handled, their revenues went down, their earnings went down, people freaked out, sold down the stock. And that's how we became the largest shareholder of the company. Now I know that sounds stupid, but that's the way it often works in reality. People are very focused on the here and now in a very narrow way and using earnings as the basis of valuation. What they were completely ignoring was this company had this amazing infrastructure all the way from gathering grain grown by the farmers, storing it, holding it, grading it, transporting it to the terminals of the ports where they had a monopoly yet again, and sending it on. So I couldn't tell you when the rains were going to come, but I could tell you the stock was cheap. And the company had a good enough balance sheet to be a survivor. So people are often very focused on earnings. That's one thing. Another thing that causes financially solvent, financially strong companies to be cheap is sometimes, I hate to say this, because the industry I operate in is populated by some very bright, very diligent people. Sometimes people get lazy. Sometimes people are not really lock themselves up in a room for one day and sit down with pencil and paper, sort of add up the numbers. And that actually produces interesting values for us. Now, sometimes there's things that are sitting there glaringly obvious to us, and And I wonder what caused people to miss this. Things that are large enough in terms of capitalization, therefore not obscure companies, things in developed markets which are very small and we focus on everything, like Singapore. Sometimes the structures in which these companies are embedded could be complex. People might not be willing to sort of do the work, the legwork, to sort of pull apart the structure, do the valuation very carefully, and do it. I mean, sometimes it's diligence. I mean, there's a lot of stuff to do. People can be very distracted. People could also have very short time horizons. Hard to tell.